Hey everyone, my name is Jordan Burns, and I'm here again talking about Portugal for my second cultural presentation. So let's just get started. So, starting with the history of Portugal in the 18th century. So, in 1703, Sir John Meuton negotiated a military treaty with Portugal on May 16th, which gave Britain an entry to Portugal and created an advantageous terms for trade. Portugal became involved in both the War of the Spanish Succession and the Seven Years' War, but despite all this was able to prosper mainly because there was a lot of wealth flowing to Brazil, where gold and diamonds were recently found in large quantities. So the War of the Spanish Succession was from 1701 to 1714, and it was the first war of modern times with theaters of war in Spain, Italy, Germany, Holland, and at sea. In 1755, Lisbon suffers from a disastrous earthquake. The man who rebuilds the city with ruthless efficiency is rewarded with the post of chief minister and a new title as Marquis of Pombal. In the remaining 20 years of the reign of Joseph, he was the king from 1750 to 1777. Pombal reforms Portugal, often with considerable brutality in keeping with the contemporary fashion of enlightened despotism. And in 1793, Portugal joins the alliance of Europe's monarchies in starting a war against the French Republic. So moving on to the 19th century, in 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Portugal, causing the royal family of Portugal to be transferred to the colony of Brazil, where it became the center of the Portuguese Empire. In 1815, Brazil was elevated to the status of being called a kingdom, which leads to Portugal changing their names from Kingdom of Portugal and Algarves to the United Kingdom, Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. In 1820, there was a revolution in Portugal. At that time, the king was still in Brazil, and in his absence, um, a group of army officers seized power, and a constitutional Cortes was formed to draw up a new constitution. However, the new constitution was not popular with everyone. Conservative landowners and the clergy strongly disliked this new liberal regimen. In 1821, the Cortes asked King João to return from Brazil. He did so and agreed to accept the new constitution, but the queen refused to. Meanwhile, the son Pedro remained in Brazil. Under his leadership, Brazil broke away from Portugal and became independent. King João died in 1826, and the heir to the throne, Pedro, was the emperor of independent Brazil, and as a result had no interest in ruling Portugal. As a result, he gave the throne of Portugal in favor to his only daughter, his 7-year-old daughter Maria de Gloria. But since she was only a child, her uncle Miguel would rule as regent. Pedro also drew up a charter to replace the liberal constitution. The charter was still limited to the powers of the monarch, but was not as liberal as the old constitution. Miguel, the regent, first agreed to accept the charter, but he soon tore it up and made himself an absolute ruler. In 1828, with the support of the conservative forces in Portugal, he made himself king. A rebellion against his absolute rule began in the Azores. In 1831, Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil, fell from power. He fled to Europe and declared himself regent of Portugal instead of his brother Miguel. Afterwards, Portugal was divided between those who wanted a traditional strong monarchy and those who wanted a liberal constitution. However, nobody was able to find an agreement that satisfied both sides. In 1838, following demands from liberals, a new constitution was introduced. However, the conservatives were strongly opposed to it, and in 1846 to 1847, civil war broke out between the two sides. It only ended when foreign powers intervened. Meanwhile, the popularity of the monarchy waned and Republican feeling grew. A Republican revolution occurred in 1891 but was defeated. Moving on to the 20th century. So, the beginning of the 20th century was marked by a radical nationalist Republican movement. In 1908, the king and crown prince were assassinated, and in 1910, after an uprising by military officers, Portugal was declared a republic. During World War I, Portugal joined the Allies, and in the post war years, political chaos deepened. Between 1910 and 1945, there were 45 changes to government, often brought on through military intervention. In 1932, Antonio Salazar, who I pictured here, became prime minister, and during World War II, Portugal was declared neutral. Salazar ruled the country for 36 years, banning political parties and worker strikes. Censorship and propaganda and force kept society in order. In 1968, Salazar suffered a stroke, and Marcelo Caetano was his successor. Military officers grew reluctant to serve in colonial wars, and several hundred of them carried out a bloodless coup on April 25th in 1974. The African colonies were given their independence, and a new constitution committed Portugal to a blend of socialism and democracy. And in 1986, Portugal joined the European Economic Community, which was later renamed to the European Union in 1992. With EU funds, Portugal went through a drastic change. It became the European Union's fastest growing country, recording an unprecedented 4.5 to 5% annual economic growth rate. And Portugal today is a very stable country, well integrated in the European Union. It's on the list of countries with very high human development, and in the future years, Portugal wants to focus its attention on bringing the country's level of skilled jobs and educational achievements closer to the average of the rest of the European countries. In 2001, Portugal hosted the European 2004 Championship. In 2007, it took over the European Union presidency when EU members signed the Lisbon Treaty. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal, which provides the EU's constitutional framework. Despite the current economic and financial crisis of the Eurozone, which has greatly affected the country, Portugal is now a country looking to the future and never forgetting its past. So moving on to Portuguese homes. So housing in Portugal is generally similar to the rest of Europe. However, there are different specialties. So most of the urban population of Portugal is actually suburban. Most families living in apartment blocks. And I posted some photos, a couple of which I took. I was in Portugal, just showing the different types of apartment blocks you might find in Portugal. So each apartment usually has two bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and one or two bathrooms. Portuguese architecture is similar to the others of the Mediterranean, and regardless of whether it's a traditional country house or a suburban apartment block, Portuguese buildings and towns look like those in Italy or Spain. Moving on to the rural homes. So Portugal has the highest rate of rural population in Western Europe. And that means about one third of Portuguese families live on farms or lands that are outside of urban areas. And there are more houses in Portugal than the total population, which is 10 million people. And that's because about half of Portuguese families own a country or holiday house, holiday is vacation, as well as the fact that many Europeans choose to spend their vacations or holidays in Portugal. And that's because Portugal has a beautiful countryside and there are lots of beaches there as well. Moving on to role expectations. So, no one gender has a specific role. I mentioned this in my other presentation. Children are brought up as an integral part of the um, family unit and are expected to contribute to the overall welfare of the entire family. Children are indulged and welcome, and they participate in most adult activities. So, there are not child activities or adult activities, they all come together and do the same thing. Adult children are expected to live at home until they're married. They do accept divorce because they feel like nobody should be unhappily married. And being LGBTQ in Portugal is a struggle, but the rights have gotten better. Portuguese society has become increasingly accepting of homosexuality, which was decriminalized in 1982, 8 years after the Carnation Revolution. But while gay people are allowed to be married in Portugal, they are still not allowed to adopt. However, individually, someone who is LGBTQ is allowed to adopt, but not together as a couple. So moving on to safety and security. So in Portugal, the crime rates are low, but the government wants you to look out for pickpocketing, handbag snatching, and theft from cars because that is common. So they just advise that you keep your purse in your front, your phone and your wallet in your front pockets, and just to keep a lookout for any like suspect behavior, anyone who could be stealing from you. Um, Also, sexual assault there is very rare, but they do advise to watch out for date rape drugs such as GHB and liquid ecstasy. So they just advise, same as America, to buy your own drinks and to keep an eye on your drink, to never leave it without someone, like without unattended. In regards to terrorism, there is an underlying threat from it, and while attacks are unlikely, they could be discriminate, including in places frequently traveled by foreign travelers and um, just tourists. And there also is a higher threat of terrorist attack globally. against UK interests and British nationals from groups or individuals by the conflict of Iraq and Syria. So they just advise everyone to be vigilant. Moving on to American law breaking. So when you are in Portugal, you are suspect to its laws, even if you are a US citizen. Foreign laws and legal systems can be vastly different from our own. So criminal penalties will vary, but if you break a local law, your passport is not going to help you avoid arrest or prosecution. Um, so they want you to not buy or counterfeit, not buy counterfeit or pirated goods, even if they are widely available. These are not only illegal to bring back into the United States, but you also probably going to be breaking local law. And they really have a strict drug possession like prohibition. Um, they just a lot of people are get caught with personal drugs, and they don't want you to do that, and you will get in trouble for it. And this is dealing with how to handle incidents of police detention or harassment. So, based on the Vienna Convention of Consular Relations, bilateral agreements, and customary international law, if you are arrested in Portugal, you do have the right to request that the police, prison official, or whatever authority is arresting you to alert the U.S. Embassy and to have your communications forwarded to the U.S. Embassy so that the embassy is able to help you and that they are aware of your situation. So, language barriers. So, many people in Portugal do speak English because there's now a requirement in schools for them to learn English in one other language. But this law was created recently, so this is not really applied to the older generations. I learned this talking to a guy at a bakery. He was saying, because we spoke in English, and he was saying how he learned English and French alongside with Portuguese growing up, and it's just common for everybody around here our age to speak English. And he thought English was so cool, he loved it. So even with many people speaking English, there's definitely a language barrier, and that's just as a result of living in different countries that don't speak completely the same English. So moving on to greeting etiquette. It is appropriate to shake hands with everyone in a formal situation, and that generally means that you don't know the person or you haven't met them before. And this usually applies to men, women, and older children. And the handshake, whether at a social or business meeting, is accompanied by direct eye contact and the appropriate greeting. One is supposed to shake hands upon leaving, and when greeting acquaintances or friends or somebody you know, um, men embrace and pat each other on the back, and women kiss both cheeks, starting with the right. And between women, you only shake hands in formal occasions, and that's if you don't know the person at all. And I put the hola because that's how you say hello in Portugal. Gift giving. So if you're invited to a Portuguese home for dinner, bring flowers, good quality chocolate, or candy to the hostess. Do not bring wine unless you know which wine your host prefers. And do not give 13 flowers. This is considered unlucky. Just don't give 13 of anything. 13 is just a really unlucky number to them, and they don't want that in their home. Do not give lilies or chrysanthemums since they are used at funerals. And do not give red flowers since red is the symbol of the revolution. And just keep in mind that gifts are usually opened when received, so they will probably be opening that right in front of you, not opening it later after you have left. And last but not least, the views on Americans. I learned this from this blog I read and just from talking to people in Portugal. They see us as hardworking, confident people who are flexible. You know, for example, if we get a job offer in Seattle and we live in LA, like or New York, we would move if it's a better job and we want to take it. While many people in Portugal would stay the job closer to their families. As a result, they think we're not as family oriented, but they do think that we have more opportunities available to us because we are more flexible. And like I said earlier, they love English language, think it's cool. So yeah, that's my second presentation on Portugal. As I say to ciao, I also attached some more photos from my time in Portugal. Um, these are all in the Lisbon area or in an area like on the outskirts of Lisbon. So yeah, thank y'all for listening and to ciao.